Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. Today we're tackling what photo school doesn't teach anymore. So I can only guess, Russell, we might be going back to a little bit of the basics or taking a step backwards in our learning journey today.
We are, and photo school is kind of a loose term. It's not an official photo school, but I kind of consider everything, all the sources of knowledge that we have about photography today being photo school. So there's a few things that I've noticed that people don't really talk about today that they used to talk about a little more. So that's what I'm sharing with you today.
I love it. One step back to go many steps forwards. That's going to
Yep.
be the mantra for today. I'll turn it over to Russell. Huge thank you to him for coming back as always on our platform, and to all of our viewers. You should know the drill by now. If you're a new viewer, well, we will answer your questions live here if you do have them. So drop them into the YouTube chat. And Russell, I'll see you in a bit for the Q&A.
Hey, welcome everybody. Usually, if you see me on these webinars before, usually I'm coming to you live from Hackberry Farm in Dodge City, Texas, and I didn't change this today. I'm coming to you live from just right outside of Yellowstone National Park. I'm in Gardner, Montana. We've been up here for about the past couple of weeks, just trying to make pictures and expose people to some wonderful locations and wonderful experiences. And so we're on the tail end of it now, but I wanted to make time to be with you guys today. Uh, this isn't a live background. I wish it was, but where you go to this spot in the park, Soda Butte, they don't have Wi-Fi there, so I had to come back in today in the middle of the day for this webinar. But I'm glad I did. And so, like I mentioned to Derek earlier, today I'm going to talk about things they don't teach in photo school anymore. And I got to give you a little background. When I mean photo school, I don't mean any kind of formal school that you may go to. I mean just kind of the collective knowledge that you kind of hear floating about the ether all the time. And a lot of this stuff I garnered from doing a lot of the workshops I do. You'll introduce new concepts to people, and uh, it'll be things they've never heard, or you have people ask questions, and it's all kind of based upon things that I sort of learned 35 years ago when I was learning how to take pictures. But in today's modern age, when there's so much knowledge out there, I'm not going to say no one ever talks about this stuff, but it seems like some of these concepts get a little bit lost in the noise. And so I wanted to sort of bring them back up. Now, a lot of these concepts we'll talk about today are sort of in the vein of nature photography, but they really apply to just about any kind of photography you can think of. Especially there's a few points that apply to any kind of photography you can think of, any genre of photography you can think of. So whether you're a nature photographer here or whether you're just a general photographer, I think you may find some things that you'll find helpful here, and help you on your journey to becoming a better photographer. Now, one of the things I want to make really clear is I want this to be a dialogue and not a monologue. So as Derek said before he went off, if anybody has any questions, just pop them into the chat. We'll get to those as we go along here. So, with that said, let's get started. Things they don't teach in photo school anymore. One of the things I love doing, and I've had a passion for it for a long time. I love capturing the natural world. I grew up in a rural, or I grew up in the country on a small farm and ranch north of Dodge City, Texas. In fact, the farm I live on now is has been in my family for a long, long time. I'm just the latest one to own it. And growing up, when I got my first camera, when I got really interested in photography at the age of, I don't know, 15 or 16, something like that, I became enamored in the two things that I was, so the two things with which I was most familiar. One was kind of the farming, ranching, rural lifestyle, the kind of, the people and the places I was raised around. And number two was the natural world. Because one of the things I loved doing when I was out doing my chores, or when I didn't have to do chores, just out, I'd roam creek bottoms and look for wild things all the time. And as I got older and have been blessed to be able to make my living as a photographer, I've been really blessed to be able to see a lot of remarkable places there. And so that's one of so when I talk about these things I'm going to talk about today, I don't really talk. I'm not really an arrogant person. I'm not really that much of an opinionated person, if you want to know the truth. And so really, I give these today in the spirit of really kind of putting more arrows in your the proverbial quiver of your knowledge that just a few more things you can think about as you're going out taking pictures of any sort, whether landscape pictures like this of the waterfall there in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, or you get lucky enough to see a really cool backlit bear at eye level like you see on the right. These are just things you can put in your quiver and kind of add to your knowledge base, that as you go out and you begin to make pictures, it just makes you more effective because you got more tools in the toolbox from which to choose. And So it's going to be interspersed with some cool pictures, and I'll talk through some of them about how it's relevant to the points I'm going to make. But a lot of these are just going to be kind of straight to forward points that I'll make. One of them is I used to hear this all the time because there was a time when I remember my first camera I ever had. It was a Vivitar camera. Didn't even, the only reason it needed a battery in it was to run the little needle meter that was inside. The thing was all mechanical, and you could set. I learned early on because this was a trick that I learned back when we all shot film. Is on the film canisters they had an exposure guide based on if everything is in full sunlight, what your exposure should be. So I learned early on that these cameras are calibrated to 18% gray. Now, how that translates into digital, now we have these sophisticated metering systems that help us with this problem. But the truth is, the meters are not infallible. I mean, even though they've gotten a lot better over the years, the camera meters can still be fooled. A typical example I talk about all the time is if you're shooting a subject that's lit in full sunlight, but it's against a dark background, it can be a deer or a squirrel or a person. If they're lit in full sunlight and they're against a dark background like some shade or a line of dark trees, a scenario like that will almost always fool a camera meter, and the camera tends to overexpose a picture in that scenario. Happened to me this morning. We had an elk bugling just about 5 miles from where I'm sitting now. We had an elk bugling. It was against a really dark background, and when the camera guesses what the exposure ought to be, it always guesses wrong because that dark area of the scene it kind of throws it off, and it tries to put everything to 18% gray. If you think about the histogram in your camera, and you got your left side the bright side, the right side is or left side's the white, right side's the black. 18% gray is that point right in the middle. Now, I'm not smart enough to know. Don't ask me why it's not 50% gray, but 18% gray are what all these cameras are calibrated towards. And so when a subject, a scene is tricky, it's lit in a tricky way. In other words, you got a brightly lit subject and a dark background. The camera tends to try to push everything to the middle of the histogram. It wants to make everything 18% gray. And so because of that, if you've got a dark background, the cameras are going to tend to overexpose. Conversely, and I say this one last because everyone can relate to this scenario. Conversely, if a scene has a bright background, in other words, you've got a fully lit subject against a bright background like snow. I wish I could see a show of hands of how many people have ever taken a picture of something in the snow, and the snow always ends up being gray and kind of dull looking, and it's not white like you perceive it with your eye. And the reason why is just like cameras tend to try to uh, overexpose when you have a dark background, when you have a bright background like snow, it tends to underexpose it, and that's why the snow looks gray. It tries to push all of those clippings on the that are on the edge of your histogram back towards the middle, and so the cameras just can't get it right because the camera doesn't know what it's looking at. And so a lot of times, what I will do is if I'm in full sunlight, and this is an old film trick I learned a long time ago. Sometimes if I'm in full sunlight, the northern blue sky is roughly 18% gray. So if you're looking for something to calibrate and check your exposure, because if you're exposing for something in bright sunlight, the sunlight that's on that subject is the same sunlight that's hitting the northern sky. So a lot of times what I'll do to check is I'll point my camera at the northern sky, check my exposure, dial it into what it says it should be, and then recompose. The camera's going to tell you it's wrong, the exposure is going to be wrong. The camera will tell you it's going to be underexposed or overexposed, but that's where you have to trust your intuition. And it's not completely infallible, but if you're having a tricky exposure and you're trying to figure out how to expose for the highlights, northern blue sky, roughly 18% gray, you pointed at that, it'll get you in the ballpark almost every time. And then because the reason why all the camera meters in every camera, they're all calibrated to the same thing. And in nature, it's the same thing as using a gray card. In nature, the northern blue sky is the equivalent is a free gray card that you can use all the time. Back in the day, people, even in the early days of digital, people always used to use gray cards to try to calibrate their exposure to make sure that the scene, their cameras are set to the tricky scene in the background. Studio photographers still do that a lot. And so right above those trees where the sky gets the darkest blue, that's roughly 18% gray. And that's a good place. Again, if you're trying to figure out an area with a lot of dark and a lot of light, look for that mid-tone, and the mid-tone that's reliable to find is a sunlit northern sky. Works every single time. Take my word for that because I still do it a lot. I talk about this a lot, and I talk about it in almost every webinar I do because really I think it's big. Now I know people don't talk about the. I know people still talk about the fundamentals of photography, but I think knowing the fundamentals of photography are key. You know, the technology we have access to today is incredible. I mean, just off the shelf, if you've got the money to spend, if you've got the money and or the inclination to spend it, you can go buy the best lenses. You can buy the best cameras. Excuse me, my nose is itching. You can buy the best cameras. You can really get a top-notch kit right off the shelf, and in short order, because the cameras have gotten to the point where they've got them fairly easy to try to figure out in the first place. In short order, you can be making pictures just right out of the box, and then if you add all the software we have available to us, like the denoise software and the sharpening software and all of those things, it 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 tends to make you think that you don't really need to understand the fundamentals. You just need to go out and take pictures. And taking pictures is key to getting better. And I'm a believer is the only way you're going to learn to take better pictures is to go out and take pictures and learn from your mistakes. But I think it gets overlooked sometimes the importance of fundamentals. It's as simple as this. And I'm not saying it's me, but someone that's really adept with the camera that knows what they're doing can take a 20, 25, 30-year-old film camera and outshoot from all the measures that we think make successful photographers, outshoot someone that's got all the latest gear that really doesn't have a fundamental understanding of photography. Another analogy, it works like this. You could go buy me the best golf clubs in the world, the best balls, the most technology they can put in golf clubs and golf balls in the world, and put me on a golf course. And then you could take Tiger Woods, for example, and then go buy him a set of 1958 blades that someone bought from a garage sale down the road and put those in his hands and use just old antiquated technology and put us in a match together on a golf course. And who's going to win every time? I can tell you it's going to be Tiger Woods. And the reason why Tiger Woods wins every time is he's got a good fundamental understanding of the game, how to swing the clubs, how to grip the clubs right, all the things you got to do to be better at that. He just has a better understanding of it. And so, because of that, the game is a whole lot less frustrating to him than it would be to me that doesn't understand the fundamentals as well and just can't play the game as good, no matter how much technology you put in my hand, because I don't have a grasp of some of the fundamentals. It becomes frustrating and I quit golf. I can tell you for a fact, working with thousands of people teaching them photography, it's the same way with photography. People get frustrated because they spend a lot of money on equipment and because they don't have a good grasp of the fundamentals of photography, a lot of times their photography falls short. They may get a good picture every now and then, but I think the thing that everybody strives for when you're doing photography is you want to get good pictures, but I think more than anything, you want to be consistent in your picture making abilities. Every time you go out, you want to be able to take a picture and know that that's going to be a pretty good picture, whether you look at it on the back of the camera or not. You know, it's the old phrase they used to use, I think, is called chimping. In the early days of digital, people would take pictures and then they'd immediately look at the back of their cameras. I've gotten now because I've done it so much, and I think this is where everyone ought to strive to be, is a lot of times I may check them from time to time just to make sure my settings are right, but a lot of times I don't go back and look at my pictures till I'm back home and I'm looking at them on the screen in front of my computer because that's when you get the confidence to know that you have a fundamental understanding of photography and that every time you push the button, you've got a chance of making something pretty special each and every time. You know, I use sports a lot to draw analogies with photography. It's the highest paid baseball players that aren't pitchers in the major leagues, they get paid a pile of money for being consistent. They can consistently hit good. And so I think that's the thing that everyone sort of try to be is just consistent. When they make good pictures, they understand what it took to make good pictures, and they can do that, excuse me, over and over and over again. And I think that's really, really important. And so you may be wondering, what are the fundamentals of photography? Well, in my mind, the fundamentals are a mastery of the technical aspects. You know that whole shutter triangle, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and how it all sort of works together. And understanding those things, like I talked about earlier, when you look at a scene and you just know instinctively, well, because of the makeup of this scene, my subject's in full sun, there's a shadow behind it. The camera's going to tend to overexpose the picture, and how to adjust from there. So there's an aspect on the mastery of the technical aspects. Mirrorless cameras have made that really easy with the exposure simulation that you have. You can fix all of that in real time while you're looking through the camera. And that's become a really valuable tool for helping people understand that if I turn the shutter speed down, what's it going to do to the scene? How's it going to make things look? If I move the ISO, what's it going to do to my noise? If I change the aperture, how is that going to affect the depth of field? So mirrorless cameras have become a real world learning lab that you can get instant feedback to understand how all that works. I also think camera handling is big. I do one-on-one mentoring with quite a few people, and one of the first things I notice about their photography, and coincidentally, it's one of the first things that I was pointed out to me when I was a young photographer about my mistakes, was camera handling. These newest cameras you can buy are technological wonders. They'll have, I don't know the tech specs on all of them, but they'll brag about having 8 stops of in camera stabilization, or no, 5 stops of in lens stabilization, 3 stops of in camera stabilization, for a total of 8 stops. Well, that's in a perfect world. That's almost like saying that my new truck my new truck I bought gets 22 miles per gallon, when in reality I may only get about 15 miles per gallon, because they test that in a perfect world laboratory scenario. I think the camera manufacturers probably do the same thing on camera, on the amount of stops and stabilization these cameras will do. But even with that said, if a camera has 8 stops of stabilization, but you're shaking at a level of 10 stops of stabilization, then it doesn't really do any good. So I think camera handling includes everything from understanding that if you're laying in a prone position, holding a telephoto lens and a camera and a telephoto lens, that's the most stable way of doing it. And then all the way to standing up and holding a big telephoto lens is the least steady way of doing it. And just understand how to compensate for all those things, and understanding the value of support like tripods and monopods. I can tell you this, back to the point I was making about the people I mentor, almost everybody I mentor, when I mention to them, put your camera on a tripod, the first thing they report to me is their pictures get instantly better. Tripods are the most low tech piece of equipment you can buy, but they really do make a huge difference on how much you can. It improves your photography because it does a lot of things. Number one, it takes out any instability you have, and so it lets your camera work for you. And all of a sudden, you can start working at lower ISOs, lower shutter speeds, and you can still hold a camera steady. Last night we were shooting pictures of elk. I was shooting at 1/30th of a second at ISO 800 because it was getting late in the evening, and I was still getting really clean, really sharp images because I had my camera on a tripod. I was letting that piece of equipment I paid so much money for work for me, instead of making me work against it by trying to handhold. And so I think the camera handling is huge. My point is, use a tripod. It really, really is. If you're shooting with the telephoto lens, it makes a huge difference, because in the hierarchy of stability, tripod is the most steady. Monopod's a pretty good alternative. Finding something to just stick your camera on, using a bean bag or some other kind of support, really works really well. And then hand holding it is probably the least stable way. And even that goes from, like I said earlier, prone is the most stable, to all the way to standing up is the least stable. Because when you're standing up holding a telephoto lens, look this up, but there's about 300 joints between your toes and your fingers that are all conspiring against you to hold that camera steady. And the older you get and the more fatigued you get, the harder it is. And older and fatigued aren't mutually exclusive necessarily, but the harder it gets to hold those cameras steady. So the easy trick is use a tripod or some other sort of support. It does wonders for your photography. I learned that early on when I was a young photographer, and that was the mistake I made. And so I still preach it today. And then understanding a composition, and understanding, things like the rule of thirds, and leading lines and triangles and curves and all those little nuances that go into making good composition. I think those are the three main fundamentals of photography. I really do. And I think if you can get a mastery of all three of those, all of a sudden uh, it makes your keeper rate go up, it makes you more consistent, and you become happier with the process of image making. Now, I'm not going to say people don't teach this anymore, but sometimes in the age of technology, a lot of that gets lost because people seem to indicate, I'm not going to say anyone says it overtly, but all the messaging we get seems to indicate that, well, if it's a little fuzzy, it's okay. You can run it through the software and the software will sharpen it. I'm just a believer you get it right in the camera, the less work you can do on the back end, the happier you are, the less time you spend, and then that gives you more time to go out and spend time making pictures, which is going to make you a better photographer. Yeah, most of these pictures you see, by the way, are right out of the camera, how they look. And it's using all those fundamentals of camera handling techniques. This is what we've been chasing this week. This picture wasn't taken this week. It was taken a couple of years ago. But if you've never been to the mountains when the elk are in rut and hear that bugle sound, it's a pretty magical sound. And it's one of those things that'll kind of send chills up your spine when you hear it. It's just pretty neat to be in the midst of that. And again, this is a big white-tailed deer I photographed a couple of years ago in the frost. And just you, and when you have a good handle on the fundamentals of photography, all of a sudden, when a scene like this and a wild animal appears in front of you, you can react to it a lot quicker and make sure you get the picture you need to get and want to get without missing stuff like this because you're fumbling around with trying to get your settings right. This is another thing that I used to hear a lot about. You just don't hear much about anymore. Calibrate your camera with one another. And what I mean by that is, cameras are electronic and mechanical components that are made by a combination of robots and people. And as such, there can be some variation in their tolerances and how they work. One of the things I always try to do is when I buy new cameras, I will point the new cameras. I'll put a lens on a tripod, put my old camera on it, take a picture, look at all the exposure specs, set the new camera the same way, and then put it back on that same lens, pointing at the same thing, and take another picture with the new camera. Because what I'm looking for is there any variation in how the cameras read the scenes? I used to always do this with film cameras, but what you're looking for is there a variation between the cameras? One camera you may find out meters a scene, one third of a stop overexposed compared to your other camera. And it's always good to know that. So if you need to preset some stuff, some exposure compensation or whatever already built into your cameras, because I've seen it before. Uh, I'm not picking on Canon. I shoot Canon cameras and I've seen it before where, I have like a Canon. This is back in the DSLR days, but I had like a Canon 1D Mark IV camera, I think it was, and then I had a 5D Mark II camera, and then both of those cameras would read scenes differently. The exact same scene, the 5D Mark II would tend to overexpose it compared to the other camera, and that's just good information to know. You can adjust for that on the fly using exposure compensation, but it's just good to know how the cameras read a scene differently because it just helps you in the field. Back to that sense I talked about of just getting things right in the camera, it just helps you along with that. And so again, what I do is I set up one lens, same lens, and on a tripod pointing at the same thing, and I just put the different cameras on the lens and then take pictures. And I'll still do that exercise about once a year just to see if anything's drifting, because again, these are mechanical and electronic devices, and as you know, they're not infallible. Things break, things start to go wrong over time, and they'll give you a heads up if one camera needs to be fixed. It's better to find out that the cameras aren't reading exactly like each other when you're back at home and take steps to either buy a new camera or go get one looked at or readjusted or fixed than it is to be in the field and have a crucial scene play out in front of you and then just all of a sudden things aren't working like you expect it to work. And so I think that's a good tip as well. And so when things like this happen, I am told these are frigate birds, and I'm told that they fly 23 hours a day and they only roost for 1 hour a day. And I say I'm told that because I've read it before and biologists will talk about it. I've just never stuck around to watch them flying around for 23 hours a day. But anyway, of all the places these two frigate birds could land, they chose this same stick and they fought over it for about 5 minutes. Well, if you're trying to get shots like this isn't the time to have one camera reading drastically different than another camera. If you know it ahead of time, you can capture it. You want all your photo equipment to work consistently time and time again. It's the same concept of when you get in your vehicle. You don't necessarily need to know the firing order of the cylinders within your vehicle. Really, what you need to know is when I get in my car and I turn the key, will it start and get me where I want to go? That's the same thing with cameras. So that's why I recommend that check them from time to time and make sure they're calibrated and they're reading the scenes and they're operating like they are if you've got multiple camera bodies. Calibrate your camera with your monitor. We hear a lot of people talk about, especially if you're into printing, about calibrating your monitor to your printer. So that way, when you're whatever you're looking at on the screen is going to approximate what you're looking at uh, when you print it out. I think you can do a similar thing, not exactly. There's some limitations. Now, this and again, uh, full disclosure, I shoot Canon cameras. And it's just what I shoot. I'm not affiliated with Canon in any way, other than it's just what I've always shot. And the way I'm going to show you, and I talk about this was with Canon. You making with the Nikon or Sony or Olympus or Panasonic, one of these other brands. I don't know this for sure, but I think that you can do the same thing with those cameras. But when I say calibrate your camera with your monitor, is I go into Canon in my Canon menus and I find my display brightness. So in other words, the back of the camera, how it displays an image when I'm done. And what I will do is I will hold my camera up to next to my calibrated computer monitor and I will adjust the brightness to approximate my computer screen as much as I can and make those two screens look alike. And again, it's not a deep adjustment. All I'm doing is adjusting the display brightness on my camera, but I'm trying to approximate the back of my camera, making it look as much like, and I'm using the same image to calibrate it. So I take a picture on my camera, download it to my computer, display it on my computer, display it on the back of my camera, and then adjust the brightness so the back of my camera looks like as much like my computer as I can. And the reason why I do that is when you're in the field and you're previewing images, that you want to have a good approximation that when you look at the picture on the back of the camera, you have a good understanding of what it's going to look like when you get it back into the computer later on. And that used to be a thing that was pretty common that people would talk about doing all the time. And I just don't see many people talking about this as much. But again, all it does is it just gives you the confidence you need when you're looking at stuff, when you're previewing stuff, is things are going to look like you expect it to look when you get back to your computer at home. The and sometimes you also figure out that some of the cameras you can't make it look right. Again, I don't know, and I'm not picking on Canon when I say this, but I had that same Canon 5D Mark II I had that I mentioned earlier. When you would look at pictures on the back of the camera, I just had to learn that they don't. I mean, when I first started using that camera, they just didn't look right. No matter how much I adjusted the display brightness, when I look at a picture on the back of the camera, it just didn't look right. It always looked a little bit overexposed and a lot of blacks, and I think and that was one of the early cameras, and I think the display was probably just off a little bit. But I learned that, and I had it figured out. So when I was in the field, I would learn I could use that as a preview, but it wasn't going to be gospel to how that picture was going to look when I got it back into the computer back at home. To me, it's important to know all that stuff. Again, I've mentioned a couple times already, but these are electronic devices, and they're not infallible, electronic and mechanical devices, and they're not always infallible. They do mess up or they do drift from their initial settings, and you have all these issues that can go wrong with them. And so it's best to know how to adjust to that stuff as you kind of go through your photographic journey. Because again, my whole goal is to understand all these things ahead of time. So when and I'm not by nature, if you watch me enough, I'm kind of a slow moving, sort of methodical. I mean, I'm not over analytical. I'm just, I guess the best word I can use. I'm pretty laid back. And so, but I'm not much of a control freak, except when it comes to doing pictures. And so my goal is all these things I'm talking about, all these new little tips I'm hoping to bring back up into the collective knowledge base of the photography, educational, industrial complex is to try to control. It all goes to one thing: try to control as much as you can, especially when it comes to the nature of photography. Try to control as much as you can to the point when things become uncontrollable. And the things that become uncontrollable is I'd love to have overcast weather all day this week, but we've had sunny skies all day long. It kind of hampers our photographic efforts, pushes them to the morning and to the evening. And that's okay because I can't do anything about the weather and I don't lose any sleep over it. The same thing with wildlife. When an animal like this cormorant spreads its wings out to dry them out, I just want to make sure I know how every single thing works. And when I take that picture, I've got pretty good confidence without ever looking back at the image that I got the picture when the moment counted. And that all goes back to all the things I've been talking about before, calibrating your cameras, make sure that they're reading scenes correctly and understanding the fundamentals of photography and understanding camera handling techniques. All those things go into it. Now, if I go and all of a sudden the cormorant doesn't show up or the cormorant doesn't stretch its wings like that, I've done all I can do to be prepared for it. Just can't control what the cormorant's going to do. So I think about those things a lot, think about them all the time. Here's another thing. I talk about this all the time, and it gets a little tricky now. We've got the micro thirds format or the micro four thirds format or the APS-C sensors or the medium format sensors, but all the lenses that we kind of look at today and how they're expressed in terms of their power is all based on that old 35 millimeter film model. So back in the day, if you shot a 50 millimeter lens, they used to call them a normal lens. And the reason why they called them a normal lens is 50 millimeters is how we see. It's neither uh, if you shoot with a 50 millimeter lens, that's equivalent to your eyesight. It's neither a telephoto or a wide angle scene you're looking at. And so I think that's important to know because when you start putting on like a 500 millimeter lens, for example, that if you look at binoculars, and I never understood why these same concepts were expressed this way, but in film and in cameras, we express magnification or wide angle in millimeters, but in like binoculars or telescopes or spotting scopes, it's in the number X. So a 500 millimeter lens is equivalent to a 10X telescope or a 10X spotting scope or a 10X uh, or a 10X binocular. So they're all the same. And I like to kind of keep that in mind for when I think an important piece of equipment you can have that's non-photography related especially when you're going out to look for animals is a pair of binoculars. So I like to buy binoculars that's based on, like a 10X because I know when I look through binoculars, they'll give me an approximation of how I view. So how my 500 millimeter lens is going to view that scene. And so I think it's important to know 50 millimeters is how we see the world because all of a sudden you can just do in your mind the amount of magnification that a lens is. 200 millimeter lens is a 4 times magnification for my normal vision. 25 millimeters going the other way would be twice the angle that we can see with our 50 millimeter vision. So it just kind of helps me calibrate that in my mind and helps me kind of understand these the power of these various lenses that we have in our arsenal and how to best utilize them to the fullest and try and achieve our photographic vision. I'll also say this too, and this is kind of an aside. This isn't things you teach in photo school anymore, but this is one thing I try to teach people all the time. A good exercise you can do is take a 50 millimeter lens and take it outside, no matter what kind of picture you're doing, whether it's nature or pictures of your kids or grandkids or your pets or whatever it is. Spend a day with a 50 millimeter lens and learn how to make compelling pictures with that camera. You want to talk about an exercise that'll make you so much better at composition and so much better at looking for new angles to take pictures and so much better understanding the relationship with how close the subject is to the camera and how far that in relation the background is from the subject and trying to get those soft and really creamy and out of focus backgrounds. Uh, try 50 millimeter lens because I do that a lot for myself. When I find myself kind of getting stale in my composition and how I see the world and how I see scenes, I'll put a 50 millimeter lens on because it forces me to try to make compelling pictures how I see the world. And again, teaches you a lot about different angles, different, in the beginning, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but in the beginning, we're taught the best angle of light when you're doing just about any kind of outdoor photography is have the light source or the sun behind you. Well, using a 50 millimeter lens a long time ago is where I kind of learned the technique of backlighting subjects. And just again, all I did was I was just trying to photograph something that was mundane and try to make it look really compelling in a different light. I'll tell you what it was. It was oats. Like the oats you eat in all kinds of breakfast cereals and oatmeal and all that. It was some oats growing in a farm field, and I was trying to figure out how to make them sort of look sort of compelling and a little bit sexy. And so using that 50 millimeter lens, I found an angle and had them backlit, and it just looked wonderful. And from there, a light bulb went off, and I shoot a lot of pictures now backlit. And I did that probably 20 or 25 years ago is when I learned that. But just the fact that I limited myself from using any kind of uh, zoom lens or wide angle lens or telephoto lens. I made force myself to take good pictures with that 50 millimeter lens, and it's really is a good technique on learning how to see and learning how to take pictures. This was the 50 millimeter lens I shoot. It's a 50 millimeter f1.4. You can buy those pretty inexpensively all day long. And they used to ship those normal lenses with cameras all the time, but now I don't know if you can buy them with a 50 millimeter lens anymore. You've got to purposely go out. I know a lot of the cameras, at least the kit lenses, are kind of like an 18 to 55 millimeter sort of range. But if you want to have an exercise in learning how to become a better photographer and learning all those things we've talked about in terms of the fundamental, that 50 millimeter lens goes a long way in helping you learn how to shoot portraits like this woman here who this was shot with the 50 millimeter lens. And it teaches you, again, if we've got a background that's kind of compelling, if we move her away from the background and closer to the frame, and we've got that 50 millimeter lens, with that 50 millimeter lens as well, when you're taking pictures of people, it doesn't distort the background or her face or in any kind of way. It's just a good natural look is how we would see other people. But it just teaches you like this picture here was shot in natural light, indirect light, open shade with the light kind of wrapping around the this is an old box car, train car she's standing in front of, and just using all those elements that you have and using just a single lens to try to be more creative. That's sort of the spirit that was made. And I even made this picture. This is on Hackberry Farm back in Dodge City, Texas. And this was of the fireflies. First firefly picture I ever took. I used a 50 millimeter lens because I wanted everything to look like I was seeing it at night with no wide angle, no telephoto. I wanted the fireflies to appear a natural size and natural shape in the image, as well as the sunflowers and the farm road and everything else. I wanted to appear natural. And so that's why I shot that with a 50 millimeter lens. And then a lot of times when you're out, like again, I point back to this morning, we had a bunch of elk in front of us, and really there were a lot of people around, and I was telling people in the group, if you want to find the best angle of light, point your shadow at the subject. That's so elementary, but that's the way I learned, because what that tells you a couple of things. Number one, during the middle of the day when you don't have much of a shadow, it's harder to point it at the subject, and so then. Uh, Maybe it's not the best time to take pictures. I know, especially when you're doing outdoor photos, the middle of the day, the light's the harshest. It's the worst angle you can choose. It just doesn't look good. It's not a good color of light. And so, if you're looking for the best angle of light, if you've got a big long shadow and you can point at the subject, it's going to tell you a couple things. Number one, the quality of the light's going to be beautiful that time of day because it's probably going to be in the golden hour, either in the morning or in the evening. Plus, whatever animal or whatever tree or plant or whatever you're looking at, you'll get the most direct lighting on that subject if you just point your shadow at the subject. And here's some examples here. And I still use that all the time when I'm trying to line up the best angle of light to shoot a subject. This bobwhite quail was calling from a fence post. He has two legs. He had one of them tucked up underneath him as he was calling, but I was actually in my pickup when I shot this picture using a bean bag for support with my telephoto lens, but I drove until my shadow from the pickup truck was pointing at that bird and be able to get the best quality and the best angle of light. And then same way with this coyote. I've Again, I've been blessed to own land and be able to build some kind of permanent blinds on land that I own. And one thing I've always tried to do is think about the end result in mind and situate those blinds that when the sun comes up, it's pointing directly at the subject. And this is a coyote. This one of my favorite coyote pictures I've ever taken. Beautifully lit. The sunlight's just, if you could see my shadow, it's pointing right at the coyote. And then what I like about that angle of light is you can look at it not only in this quail's eye, but also in the coyote's eye, and you get that thing that's so important that kind of brings life to an image is that catch light in their eyes. And so I just always love this angle. And then same way there. Just this is an example I was talking about earlier. Uh, Taking a picture of a dark subject like a turkey on a dark background like these woods back there. It's not as hard as you think. because again, the camera has issues with a scene like this. And what I've learned over time and through a little bit of photo analysis is usually a scene like this, the way the camera reads it, if you just dial in your exposure as a -1, underexpose it by a stop, it'll almost be exactly right each and every time. And so my process is on a shot like this, I shoot aperture priority a lot. And the reason why I shoot aperture priority is because there's three buttons you can turn to make exposure on a camera. It's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And I have found by shooting aperture priority, I'll set my aperture. I like a really wide open aperture, as you can see in these pictures that I take, with a really out of focus background when I'm shooting pictures of wildlife. And then I will set the ISO at a static level. I'm not a big fan of auto ISO, so I set the ISO where I want it. Again, it's all about controlling all the variables you can to the point you can't control it. So I'll set the ISO, I'll set the aperture, and then I'll let the camera set the shutter speed. And the reason why I do that, that's one less button for me to turn, and it eliminate or one less dial for me to turn, and it eliminates at least a third of the mistakes I may make myself when I'm trying to react to something quick. And so really all I've got to do then is look at a scene and decide, is the camera going to overexpose or underexpose this scene? Because it's got a dark background, I know it's going to tend to overexpose it, and I compensate by doing -1. If you take a picture it's too bright, it tells you in your mind you've got to take light away or minus. So -1 stop. If the camera, conversely, if a scene is too dark when you first take it, you got to add light or plus, and so you add 1 stop of light or +1. Usually it's +1 on bright backgrounds like snow, -1 on dark backgrounds like this right here. And so because I planned everything in advance, kind of knew where these turkeys were going to be because I scouted them. I knew the angle of light where to set my blind to be able to hide from them. And then all I had to wait, and I knew what the exposure was going to be. All I had to wait for him to step in that little spotlight of light on top of that little rise and wait for him to gobble like that. And so he did, controlled all the things I could, understood all the fundamentals, understood how the meters work, how they're going to see things, and shot the picture. This is really one of my favorite turkey pictures I've ever taken. And it really illustrates, whether you knew it or not, how beautiful these birds are. I mean, all the iridescent feathers they have and everything else is just incredible to be able to see that. And I teach this a lot too. I started taking pictures when all I had were manual focus cameras. And so I'm not going to sit here and say I'm like a purist, because like everybody else, I embrace technology. I love the things that you can do with cameras today, like eye tracking, focus, and all that. It's just they're miraculous that they can do that. But I still remind people that manual focus is still a valuable tool, because there's times, especially in nature photography, that the autofocus just won't work. A good example is again in this I use Canon. But I think this is true to just about every camera brand. When the eye tracking is trying to work, the the camera is not thinking consciously that, oh, I'm looking for this animal's eyes, because it doesn't know what it's looking at. It's looking for a point of contrast in the scene. And if you do outdoor photography very much, you know there's a billion points of contrast in some scenes. A good example is last year when I'm in Africa. Mother Nature proved to me with this eye tracking focus of how zebras can fool their predators so well with stripes on their bodies. Because no matter how hard these advanced cameras try, they couldn't find the eyeball on a zebra when a zebra is a study in contrasting colors. It would try to pick everywhere where a white stripe, the white coat and a black stripe came together, and it still fooled it. And so to overcome that, manual focus is kind of the way to go sometimes. And that may work if you're shooting a scene where an animal's up in some trees and the tree is lit and there's a lot of light and a lot of dark areas in the trees. It also works good on things like the snow, where the this is in a heavy snow. This is in Yellowstone a couple of winters ago when there's a coyote out in front of us, real heavy snowstorm, and the autofocus kept trying to pick up the snowflakes as they were blowing through. And so in that case, manual focus is still a valuable tool. So I encourage people to know where your on off switches for your manual focus, and then commit it to muscle memory, which way that lens turns to go from close focus to infinity. And so that way, when the scene happens in front of you, it's just automatic. You switch it to manual focus, you reach up, you turn the lens the correct direction, and you're able to lock in the focus manually. and use all those tools that we have to our in our arsenal today, especially with mirrorless cameras like focus peaking or the focus guides that are built inside the camera, and use those to help you focus. And don't always rely on autofocus because again, manual focus is still a pretty valuable tool. That's why they haven't taken that ability away from image makers yet when it comes to using the more advanced digital SLRs or digital mirrorless cameras. You still want to try to be able to use manual focus as much as you can. And then ultimately, lenses are the limiting factor. It's one thing, again, that and it may be a lot of it may be marketing, but one thing to remember, especially if you're a beginning photographer, is you can take the best lenses made by manufacturer and put the worst camera, the least, I say worst, none of these cameras are bad. You can take the best lens made by a camera manufacturer and take the least advanced camera body they have and put it on that same lens and be able to make pretty good images like that. You know, you've got some limitations. You may not have the amount of megapixels you want. You may not have the frame rate that you want. The autofocus may not be as quick and snappy, but you can still do it. But you can't go the other way. It's hard to take the best camera made by these manufacturers and find a third party lens that's people just for whatever reason they're trying to save money or whatever else, put a bad lens on a good camera and expect the same results. It just doesn't work that way. So lenses ultimately are going to be your limiting factor whenever you're looking at camera gear. So the advice is pretty simple. If you're on a limited budget and you're trying to buy new camera gear, go buy the very best lens that you can afford. One thing I give a lot of advice to too, I'm not afraid of buying used equipment. I know B&H Photo has a robust inventory of used equipment from which to choose. I bought from them before in the past. If whatever rating they say it is, when you know if it's whatever rating they say it is, you can take that to the bank. It's going to be a functional piece of equipment in that rating. And as such, most of all the big lenses, expensive lenses I bought, I've always bought them used and just matched them up with the camera and buy a new camera when I feel like it's time to buy a new camera. Because again, lenses are ultimately going to be the limiting factor. And I'll repeat it one more time. If you buy a good lens and put a camera with limited capabilities on it, if you've got good fundamental techniques and an understanding of photography, you can still make good pictures with that setup. But no matter how good a photographer you are, if you put a cheap lens on the best camera you buy, no matter how good you are technically and fundamentally, it's going to be a lot harder to make good images with a setup like that as opposed to just buying good lenses. So just remember, lenses are ultimately the limiting factor. And so again, the whole key is being ready when the moment comes. This is a a raccoon in the Florida Everglades. These raccoons, they live out on the mangrove islands in the Everglades, and the only time they ever eat or drink, the only time they ever drink, because they're surrounded in salt water, is when it rains. And the only time they ever eat, they've got to wait every 12 hours when the tide goes out to expose things like these oysters. And so you'll catch them on the bank, kind of rummaging around looking for stuff. And so to shoot a scene like this, you got to be ready. You got to have good equipment. I could have shot this same picture if my camera only shot 3 frames a second. I didn't need 40 or 120 frames a second like the more advanced cameras can do to shoot this picture. I just had to be ready when the time came and then understand how my camera works and understand the limitations of the camera and shoot the pictures. But again, lenses are always going to be the limiting factor. And then this is another one too. You know, you see all these stories online now, and I get there a lot of them are clickbait, but they'll talk about the super moon and the blood moon and the harvest moon and the blue moon, all these moons and all these super moons and all this hype that goes around the super moons. I've grown up in dark skies my whole life, and honestly, a full moon when it first comes up is big and it looks impressive. I can't tell a super moon from a regular moon. So I think a lot of that's hype. I mean, I think technically they are a little bit closer if you get really into scientific measurements, but I don't think most of us can tell it. So what I try to tell people to do is once a month we have a full moon, and if you want to shoot landscapes with the moon in it, and you know we've all seen those pictures where people use 6 and 800 millimeter lens, and the moon looks enormous in the frame where it looks just not natural, uh, and that's fine to do. I'm not being critical of that, but if you want to shoot the moon where it looks a normal size in your landscape photos, where it looks a natural size in your landscape photography, you shoot it at 200 millimeters. I don't know why that is because you're still shooting at telephotos, but if you shoot the moon or the sun as it's coming up. With a 50 millimeter lens, the way we see normally, it looks like a little speck in the frame. So the sweet spot is shoot it at 200 millimeters. So that way, well, that's a picture there where I shot that with 500 millimeter lens. You can see how big the moon looks in relation to the to that scene there. But if you want it to look kind of a natural size in your scene like this, that was shot at 200 millimeters. So keep that in mind when you're shooting landscape photos, that the sun or the moon, if you want it to look a natural size, you got to shoot it at 200 millimeters for it to look right. There's another one there that was shot at 200 millimeters, just the moon setting over some canyon country out in western Texas. And that's again one of those things that I just don't see people talking about much anymore. And try it out; it really works. But you got to time it right. The good thing about it is I used to go out and look for moon landscapes or sun landscape or mainly moonset landscapes or moonrise landscapes. You used to have to kind of go do it by chance. But now there's all kinds of apps you can use to help predict where the moon's going to be at a certain time of the day, so you can go out and pre-visualize shots like this, and it makes it a lot easier. But if you want the moon or the sun to look a normal size in your pictures, 200 millimeters is your sweet spot to shoot at. And then bigger lenses sometimes aren't always a better option. And the reason why is you come to some place like Yellowstone and there may be a bear or a wolf 1,000 yards away, and you go out and you put the biggest lens you can on your camera, like a 1200 millimeter or whatever. But at some point, you run into limitations with using bigger lenses, and that to me, that point is if you're shooting through a lot of air, especially if you're out west like I am right now, and you've got a little dust blowing around, the further the subject away from you, the more particulates that are in the air, or the more heat bubbles that rise up during the middle of the day. Everything's going to conspire against you to make that shot not as sharp as it could be. And so bigger lenses aren't always a better option. And so to clarify that even more, I don't always default with, if I start with the 300 millimeter lens, I don't always think, well, I got to switch to a 600 to get closer, because a lot of times, if you can, uh, sometimes your legs are the best zoom. I used to always teach early on in my photography career that uh, the three basic rules, good rules of wildlife photography are two of the are keep the sun at your back. The three rules of photography: keep the sun at your back, use the rule of thirds, and then the main thing is get close. And so whatever you can do to get close is the way it works. And so back to that 50 millimeter strategy I talked about earlier, sometimes your legs are the best zoom. Just physically getting closer, physically getting further away from something is often the best choice. You don't always have to have a big telephoto lens. We shot some wildlife yesterday where we were able to get as close as we could legally, because the national parks have distances that you have to be away from them. So if we can get as close as we can to the subject, you eliminate all the atmospheric conditions and all the other conditions that may conspire against your image from being as sharp and as crisp as it can be, just by getting as close as you can. Sometimes it's not always an option. And if it's not, then yeah, maybe a big telephoto is. But a lot of times, uh, people just tend to get a little lazy, I think, me included. And a lot of times, the best thing to do is just try to figure out a way to physically get closer. Like this big brown bear, I was almost too close to him. Here's a good example here. I could use a giant telephoto. I've got a lot of hummingbirds on my farm, and I could use a big telephoto to take pictures of these things. But I like being able to get close, and the challenge of trying to get close. I shoot these things from about 10 feet away, and what I do is I use a 500 millimeter lens, but I use extension tubes that allow me to focus a lot closer. I could back up and put a 2x converter on that telephoto lens and make the lens 1,000 millimeters, and I could even put on the APS-C sensor or use the crop mode inside the camera and get virtually more reach than that. But to eliminate all of those things that could go wrong, stuff flying in front of it, heat bubbles flaring up, particulates in the air, all that stuff, it's sometimes best when you're shooting the telephoto lenses just to get as close as you can. And so that was my option there. And then in DSLR cameras, for the people that still use them, and you can still program this in your mirrorless cameras. There's a little button right there that's not used very often, but when you put it on F8, F16, whatever, you can press that button on the bottom. It'll give you a preview of what the depth of field is going to look like. Again, with mirrorless cameras, that's not so much of a thing anymore because you can turn on the simulation where it'll let you see what the depth of field is going to be. But in the older DSLR cameras, people still use them. That's an underutilized button right there. Because again, it'll help you preview when you're trying to figure out should you shoot a landscape scene at F8, F11, F16, F22, whatever it is. You can push that button. It'll give you a preview of how much of that area is going to be in focus. Really helpful way of learning, not only figuring out what your final picture is going to look like, but understanding what the various f-stops do in terms of how it affects your depth of field and the amount of a scene that's going to be in focus or not. And when I shot this picture in New Zealand, that's exactly what I did because I wanted this grass in the foreground to be in focus. I wanted the mountains in the background to be in focus. And to do that, I used the depth of field preview button. Same with macro. For me now, macro is really important to use because when you shoot macro subjects, you're shooting with such a limited depth of field with those highly magnified lenses. And so to make sure that the enough is in focus to get the most important thing in focus, which is an animal's eyes, then I use that depth of field preview a lot. And I even use it on my mirrorless cameras too, just as a quick way of pressing the button and seeing what it's going to look like. And then a couple more, use a flash. Historically, people don't think flashes have much of a use in the outdoors, but I've found whether you're setting a camera trap out for backyard deer like this one, where I had a little portable studio set up in my backyard when deer would walk into the scene, they would trigger their own selfies. Uh, I used the flash to help light the scene to do that. And then even like landscape photography, the good thing about flashes these days is, especially if you buy a flash that's manufactured by your camera manufacturer, they do all the they'll work wirelessly and they'll do all the heavy lifting for you. They'll analyze the scene and just put just enough flash in there where it's going to be balanced. In the old days, you had to do all these calculations and try to figure this out. But today, like on this picture here, it's real subtle. And I did it. That fence post that's on the right has a little touch of flash in there. If I wouldn't have put that touch of flash in there, it would have just been dark and wouldn't have had much texture on that side of the picture. So just a little bit of flash goes a long way on some of these scenes. Even when you're taking pictures of people, one of the things I coach to do is when you're taking pictures of people in the outdoors, face them away from the sun so they don't squint as much, but always bring in a little bit of fill light to fill in, like on this beekeeper out in western Texas. And even with wildlife, these mating frogs were shot with a. It was an overcast day and it's pretty dark, so I just brought a little bit of overhead flash under a portable softbox, and you can see the catch light in their eyes, just to bring a little bit of flash in to help brighten them up a little bit. And then I think this is the last one. Make lists. I've talked about it a lot, and one of the amazing opportunities that we have today is not necessarily camera related, but the ability to make lists of things like this and things to help you remember some of these lessons when you're in the field. Put them on your phone and just make a list until they're committed to memory. Back in the day when these cameras had when you tear the end of the film carton off that showed what the speed of film you were using, you could slide it into the back of the cameras. I always used the same kind of film, so I never needed to know what speed film I was using. And instead of the film boxes, I'd make a little cardboard list. I would just either print them out on a printer or I can write really small, write them on there, and I'd put those lists on the back of my cameras. And then even when those things went away, I would tape it to the back of my cameras. But when smartphones came out, I could just make lists and put on my phone. And so make lists of all kinds. This is kind of an open-ended uh, topic here. The list could be the steps to making a panorama shot, or remembering to use a flash, or 200 millimeters is the best way to shoot a lifelike scene with the sun and the moon or sun or the moon in it. And there's just uh, all kinds of different lists you can make. But the key thing is you've got the ability to make lists so you don't forget some of these things. Put it on your phone, add it to I use the notes section on my iPhone to put lists in, and I've got all kinds of lists too. And here in the minute, if you stick with me, I'll help you out with some of those lists. I've got some pre-made I'll share with you. Just like this, just early on, if you're learning to take pictures, this is a scene that the cameras can't always get right. When you show this to a camera, and I can remember when I shot this picture, the camera tends to overexpose this image. It's trying to bring more detail into these trees in the foreground. So one thing you may remember is who's the star of your show? it's the mountain, so I'm going to expose where the mountains look right. And if the trees go a little bit dark, you can either fix that in post or just be okay with it like it is. But sometimes you got to make a list to do those sort of things. And then I think with that said, we're getting down to the last couple of pictures. We've been at this for an hour, Derek. And so my almost my last slide is, do we have any questions we need to answer?
Oh yeah, we definitely have some questions. I want to get it
Good.
started off with a it's kind of a question, but it's more of a discussion. So we'll keep it a little brief discussion on this. One of our users is just getting started out in wildlife photography as a hobby, has experience with old 35 millimeter cameras, never used a digital camera. Any good advice for getting started in the world of digital? I guess we'll start it with, we have digital SLRs and we have mirrorless. Would you kind of steer them towards one or the other?
Yeah, I think on a positive note is, and I tell people this all the time, if you've got experience with a film camera, the jump to digital is not going to be that hard because the one good thing all the manufacturers have done is everything's still sort of calibrated like it always has been. The way we express the lens power, the way the ISO is still kind of read, it's all kind of the same as it's always been. So if you've got experience with film, you can make the transition pretty easy. My advice would be if budget's an issue, go look for old DSLR cameras that are used that still work good to kind of get your feet wet. If budget's not an issue, go ahead and make the jump to mirrorless because the thing with all those mirrorless tools like the exposure preview, it'll help speed up your learning curve quite a bit. One analogy I use with people all the time, and this is an appropriate analogy here, film or digital camera would be like the difference between driving a a 1985 Chevy Silverado pickup compared to driving a 2025 Chevy Silverado pickup. You know, the newer truck has a lot more features and bells and whistles and a little more advanced, but they all still kind of work the same. And so if you feel confident, I could get in a 1985 pickup, crank it up, drive it just like I could a brand new one. And the cameras are the same way. The features are a little different. The windshield wipers may be in a little different spot, but everything still kind of works the same like it always has. So that's the good news. So my advice will be look at your budget. If you can afford it, go ahead and get a mirrorless kit because that's the way that all these manufacturers are going. And and start learning from that. But again, it's not going to be that huge of a leap for you to learn. And if budget's an issue, man, you can get some great buys on, like a Nikon D850 or a Canon 5D Mark III or some of those really flagship in generation uh, digital SLR cameras.
Yeah,
Because the
great
good news
advice.
is, one more point on that, if you buy all new lenses for like a Canon or a Nikon, you can always buy the adapter when you get ready to move up to mirrorless where those lenses will still work. So
Definitely. And maybe we never return to crank windows again. Um,
exactly.
Steve asking, shouldn't you be using the histogram to evaluate exposure?
I don't because I mean, you can. I just don't because that's one more thing I got to look at. I mean, to me, a lot of it's just muscle memory and understanding the fundamentals because the histogram is just a graphical representation. And even the histogram sometimes will not always get it right in some outdoor scenes. Like this dolphin picture here, uh, there's a lot going on in terms of lighting here, and the camera won't always get it right. So you can't take time in a thing like this to be looking at your histogram and analyzing it. So at that point, like I said on this picture, I just know because it's a wash, rinse, and repeat mentality that I have when it comes to photography because these scenarios don't vary that much. I mean, it's a backlit subject that you're trying to get a little bit of detail in the subject. So I just knew on this thing if I overexposed it by about a third of a stop, if I let a little bit more light in, it would get a pretty close exposure, and that's what it did. And so never had time to look at the histogram, and so I just have learned over time I don't look at the histogram and don't rely on histogram. If I look at the histogram at all, it's kind of from a post-mortem standpoint where I'm sort of analyzing it after the fact to try to learn what went right or went wrong.
Interesting. Now,
Yeah,
final question here regarding the northern blue sky being 18% gray. What about in overcast days when there is no blue sky? What would be a good reference?
that's a good question. So a couple of things would be a good reference. Number one, and it's a lot about seeing. Uh, if you're Caucasian skin, the back of your hand is roughly 18% gray. And so that's a good place to start. But I barely do that because if you're using a telephoto lens, you can't focus on the back of your hands. And so just train your mind to see sort of that tan grass or that kind of light green grass or areas like that on overcast days. That'll give you a good approximation of midtone. One thing you can do, and this is where the histogram does come in handy, is if you find something you think is 18% gray, you can take a picture of it, look at your histogram, and if it's right in the middle or near the middle of the histogram, then that tells you that that's likely an 18% gray uh, scene. And that kind of helps you learn to look for those midtones whenever you're outdoors in nature to try to use it as a reference and a calibration point.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to the question before about the histogram where it's situational. You know, there's a million different ways to function and read exposure. And for the people who aren't as comfortable and aren't as sure of their footing out in the wild, there's good opportunities to practice, you know, using your downtime, like you just said there. It's like if you have a moment where you're just standing around and nothing's going on, yeah, pull up the histogram, use it, find something in your immediate surroundings that gives you that good baseline, and
Yeah.
then when you're in the moment, like you said, with like the dolphin image, you don't have time to look at your histogram. But if you practice and you get to recognize, I think it's learning to see color as if it were black and white in terms
Yes.
of this color is going to be more, you know, this is going to be closer to the right end of the histogram. This color is going to be closer to the left side of the histogram. And when you learn to see color in ranges, you know, in terms of tonality, it helps you in terms of exposure. I mean, here in New York, we have asphalt all around us. It's so easy to just point your camera at the ground, but in, you know, when you're out in the wild, it's probably not as easy, and that's where you have to learn to look at colors, like you said, and see what's a neutral color, you know, and what would relate to a medium gray.
Exactly. And I'll point this out too. Back to the guy that had the question about the histogram. I'm not saying it's wrong. But again, I love using analogies, so forgive me, but it's like, and you may have heard me say this before, but it's like if you were to say, how do I get from Manhattan at B&H headquarters to Dodge City, Texas, and I use Google Maps. Google Maps will show me three different ways of getting there, but they all point me to the same spot. And so that's what a lot of photography is. I just encourage people, if you're comfortable with using histograms all the time, just learn to use it right. And it's going to get you to the same place if you just kind of do it like I do from a muscle memory standpoint and learning to recognize midtones in nature and learning how the camera sort of sees a scene and to be able to react to that and be able to dial in exposure compensation when you know the camera's not going to read it right instead of always relying on that. So what I'm saying, my way is not the ultimate way, it's just my way. So whatever way you choose, that path you choose that works best for you, just learn to do it in your sleep and learn to do it with muscle memory. That way when the moment counts, you don't miss the moment in the end.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of the internet now and the vast expanses of knowledge that are out there because it's just like using an analogy. You know, what is an analogy? An analogy is taking a concept and finding another way to explain it so that somebody might understand it more easily. And we have the internet where now you have tons of different resources, and some people might find one way better that works
Mhm.
for them, and some people might find another way better. We had one last question that I'm going to kind of sneak in here and tie this into all this, asking, you know, if any certification program or if self-teaching is enough. There's so much information out there on the internet. A wonderful place to start, of course, shameless plug, is right here in the event space. Everything we offer is free, and we do cover really all types of photography and audio and video types of education. And if you scan this QR code, Russell has a ton of great information that he's doing down there at Hackberry Farm. So there's a lot of people that, you know, those that we work with, those that we don't work with. There's enough free information out there now where I don't think you need to go get a certification and you don't need to go to school. I'm self-taught and I've had a pretty successful photography career. And there's a lot of people who are doing even greater things that are self-taught. But look, it all depends what kind of learner you are. There's a lot of
Yeah.
schooling and education out there that is great. But even if you're taking schooling, even if you're self-taught, it's like anything else. If you want to be good at it, you have to practice. You have to get out there and really experience it and continue on in your educational journey. So I'll kick it over to you, Russ, for any final words.
Well, and my degree is in agriculture. That's what I have a degree in. So, uh, it's a wonderful medium in which to work. I tell people all the time, and I know I sound a little corny when I say this, but the amazing thing to me about photography is we all get the opportunity to catch a moment at 1,000th of a second time that has never happened before in that way, and it'll never happen again that way. And to me, that's a pretty powerful thing to do, and it's just an amazing thing to be able to go out and capture stuff like that. And I just think it's when you get a chance to do that, it's a blessing. But again, it goes back to saying that, I mean, my way of doing things is my way of doing things. But one of the things I've always been taught growing up, and one of the things I've always tried to commit myself to is just understand that if everybody's thinking the same about the topic, somebody's not thinking. So I just challenge people to go out and find that resource that works for them, that kind of meets their learning objectives, and the way figuring out ways that they learn things the best, and just go out to your point, Derek, and learning's good, but at some point the rubber has to meet the road, and you got to go out and practice just to get better.
I love it. Russ, always a pleasure having you on, man. I think one of the greatest things that you bring to this platform is that you are always unequivocally you. You do things your way. You understand that your way is your way, like you said. And there's a million ways to do a lot of different things. And all you can do it is your way. And I think that's really the best approach at the end of the day to kind of wrap this whole thing up is, we put the pieces out there and you take what you want, take a little bit from here, take a little bit from there. And art is subjective and photography as art is subjective as well. So learn what you need to learn the basics, learn the fundamentals, the foundation, and then apply it in your own way. And that's all we really want you to do is just keep creating. So I'll leave it there. Huge thank you to obviously Russell for another wonderful presentation here on another edition of the B&H Event Space. But that is all we got for you for now. We'll take it to the streets. Have a
Thank
good one,
y'all.
everyone.